She never could have imagined that a DNA test would unravel a decades-long family mystery. The results revealed her ancestry, and those outcomes were supposed to be impossible until she discovered the truth. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel and comment on which city you're from. Let's get started. Lisa couldn't stop staring at the envelope on her kitchen counter. The DNA testing kit she'd ordered had arrived 3 weeks ago, and now the results were finally here. She'd always wondered about her European roots, especially after hearing her grandmother's stories about their family coming from somewhere in Eastern Europe. The whole process had seemed so simple. Just a small tube to spit in, carefully package up, and send off to a lab. Her brother Tom had done his test last year, and they'd all laughed about his unexpected 2% Scandinavian heritage. Her hands trembled slightly as she tore open the envelope. The excitement she'd felt while waiting for the results had suddenly turned into something else. Nervousness, maybe? She couldn't explain why, but something felt different. The papers inside were crisp and official looking, with charts and percentages spread across the pages in bright colors. She scanned through them quickly, then stopped. Something wasn't right. According to these results, her genetic breakdown was completely different from Tom's. Where he had shown strong German and Polish ancestry, her results showed predominantly Italian and Greek heritage. She checked the numbers again, thinking maybe she'd misread them. But no, the percentages were clear as day. How could two siblings have such different genetic backgrounds? At first, Lisa told herself it must be a mistake. DNA testing wasn't perfect, right? She'd read about cases where results weren't totally accurate. Maybe they'd mixed up her sample with someone else's. She pulled out her laptop and logged into the testing company's website, hoping to find some explanation for the discrepancy. That's when she noticed something else, a section labeled DNA relatives. The list seemed normal at first. Cousins she recognized, distant relatives she'd never met, but whose names she'd heard before. But then she saw a name that made her pause. Sarah Mitchell, listed as a close relative, first cousin, according to the site. Lisa had never heard this name before, and she prided herself on knowing her extended family pretty well. She'd even helped organize the last 3 family reunions, for crying out loud. Confused, Lisa pulled up her mother's DNA results, which she had access to since she'd helped her mom set up the account last year. She started comparing the numbers, and her confusion quickly turned to concern. The inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Where her mother's results showed a strong Northern European background, Lisa's results suggested Southern European ancestry that couldn't be explained by either side of her family. She spent the next few hours diving deeper into the data, creating spreadsheets to compare the percentages, and trying to make sense of it all. The more she looked, the more questions she had. It wasn't just the ethnicities that didn't match up. There were other markers and genetic traits that seemed completely out of place. Her brother's results showed the classic family traits they'd always joked about. The tendency toward early gray hair, the attached earlobes, the blood type that ran in the family. Her results showed none of these. The sun had set by the time Lisa finally stopped analyzing the data. Her eyes were tired from staring at the screen, and her mind was racing with possibilities she wasn't ready to consider. She walked to the kitchen to make some tea, her go-to comfort when things got overwhelming. As the kettle heated up, she found herself looking at old family photos on her phone. Pictures of herself as a baby, toddler photos with her parents, family vacation snapshots. She studied her own features in these images with new eyes, trying to see what she might have missed before. The unfamiliar name from her DNA relatives list kept popping back into her thoughts. Sarah Mitchell. Who was she? And why did the testing company think they were so closely related? Lisa had this strange feeling in her gut, like when you're working on a puzzle and you know you're just one piece away from seeing the whole picture, but that piece is still eluding you. She picked up her phone several times, tempted to call her mother right then and there. But something held her back. These weren't the kind of questions you asked over the phone at 9 o'clock at night. Besides, she needed time to organize her thoughts, to figure out exactly what she wanted to ask. Because deep down, Lisa had a feeling that once she started asking these questions, things would never be quite the same again. Sarah Mitchell's morning routine usually involved checking her emails over coffee, but today was different. She'd received a notification from the DNA testing website she'd used a few months ago, and something about it made her pause mid-sip. There was a new match, someone called Lisa Thompson listed as a first cousin. Sarah knew all her cousins, or at least she thought she did. The family wasn't that big on either side, and growing up in North Carolina meant most relatives were just a short drive away. She clicked through to Lisa's profile, expecting to find some familiar connection, maybe a family name she recognized. Instead, she found herself staring at a stranger's family tree. None of the surnames matched anything in her family history. No Mitchells, no Clarks, no Petersons. These were all new names. Thompson, Anderson, Walsh. Sarah pulled up her own family tree, the one she'd spent countless weekends building, cross-referencing names and dates from old photo albums and her grandmother's meticulously kept journals. The hospital break room where Sarah worked as a nurse suddenly felt too quiet. She'd chosen this early morning shift specifically because it gave her these peaceful moments before the chaos of the day began. Now, sitting alone with her cooling coffee and this unexplainable family connection, the silence felt heavy. She clicked through more details, looking for any hint of familiarity, any connection to her known family history. Sarah had always been proud of her family research skills. It came with being the designated keeper of family memories. After her mother passed away 5 years ago, she'd inherited boxes of old photographs, letters, and documents. She'd organized everything, digitized the important stuff, and created a detailed family history. How could she have missed an entire branch of the family tree? It didn't make sense. Her phone buzzed with a message from the website. Lisa Thompson had viewed her profile too. Sarah's heart jumped a little. Without overthinking it, she clicked the message button and started typing. "Hi Lisa, I noticed we came up as close relatives on the DNA match, but I don't recognize any of the names in your family tree. I'm trying to figure out how we're connected. Would you be willing to help me solve this mystery?" The response came faster than Sarah expected. Lisa seemed just as confused and eager to understand their connection. They exchanged messages throughout Sarah's shift, sharing bits and pieces of family history between her rounds with patients. Each new detail only deepened the mystery. Lisa's family was from New Jersey, while Sarah's had been in North Carolina for generations. There was no obvious geographical overlap, no shared family events, no common ancestors they could find. During her lunch break, Sarah pulled up the genetic data again. The match was strong, too strong to be a mistake. She'd learned enough about genetic genealogy over the past few months to know that the percentage of shared DNA suggested a close family relationship. But how? She started drawing out possible family connections on her break room notepad, creating little diagrams with question marks and dotted lines. By the end of her shift, Sarah had exchanged phone numbers with Lisa, and they'd agreed to dig deeper into their family histories. There was something about Lisa's messages that resonated with Sarah, a similar sense of curiosity mixed with unease. They both felt like they were on the edge of discovering something important, something that had been hidden for a long time. On her drive home, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about her mother. If she were still alive, she might have had answers. Or would she? Sarah remembered how her mother sometimes got quiet when certain topics came up, how there were gaps in the family stories she told. At the time, Sarah hadn't thought much about it. Every family had its quiet spots, its unspoken stories. But now those silences seemed more significant. At home, Sarah pulled out the old family photo albums. She studied the faces in the yellowing photographs, looking for any resemblance to the profile picture Lisa had shared. Nothing jumped out at her, but something else caught her attention. In photos from the late 60s, there was a gap, almost a whole year missing. When she asked about it once, her mother had said something vague about staying with relatives that year. Sarah had never questioned it before, but now, she sent one more message to Lisa before going to bed. "I think we need to look closer at what happened in 1969. Something doesn't add up." As she set her phone down, Sarah had the distinct feeling that their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could predict. Lisa drove to her mother's house the next morning, the folder of DNA results sitting heavy on the passenger seat. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night exchanging messages with Sarah and trying to piece together their connection. The familiar streets of her childhood neighborhood seemed different somehow, as if the mystery had cast a shadow over even the most ordinary things. She found her mother, Evelyn, in the garden, wearing her favorite faded denim shirt and gardening gloves. The spring flowers were just starting to bloom, and normally Lisa would have stopped to admire the daffodils her mother had planted last fall. But not today. Today, she had questions that couldn't wait. "Mom!" Lisa called out softly, not wanting to startle her. Evelyn looked up, smiling at first, but something in Lisa's expression made her smile fade. She pulled off her gardening gloves slowly, as if buying time. "Can we talk inside?" The kitchen was exactly as Lisa remembered from her childhood. Yellow curtains, the old wooden table where they'd eaten countless family dinners, the shelf of cookbooks her mother had collected over the years. Evelyn busied herself making tea, her back turned to Lisa. "Is everything okay, honey? You seem worried." Lisa placed the folder on the table, her hands shaking slightly. "I got my DNA results back." She watched her mother carefully, noting how Evelyn's shoulders tensed at those words. "And I've been talking to someone named Sarah Mitchell." She showed up as a close relative. The mug Evelyn was holding clattered against the counter. She gripped the edge of the sink, still facing away from Lisa. The silence in the kitchen grew thick, broken only by the gentle ticking of the old clock on the wall, the one that had hung there for as long as Lisa could remember. "Mom!" Lisa's voice was barely a whisper now. "There's something wrong with my results. They don't match Tom's at all. And this woman, Sarah, she has to be related to us, but I can't figure out how. Nothing makes sense." Evelyn finally turned around. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were trembling. She looked older suddenly, weighted down by something Lisa couldn't name. Without speaking, she walked to the living room and sank into her favorite armchair. Lisa followed, carrying the folder with her. "I never thought." Evelyn's voice cracked. She pressed her hands against her face for a moment, taking deep breaths. "I never thought this would happen. DNA tests weren't even a thing back then. How could we have known?" Lisa sat on the couch across from her mother, waiting. The morning sun streamed through the windows, creating patterns on the carpet. The same carpet where she'd played as a child, where she'd opened Christmas presents, where she'd laid out her college acceptance letters. Everything in this house held memories, but now those memories felt somehow different, like photographs slightly out of focus. "I was 16. Evelyn finally began, her voice quiet but steady. "It was 1969, and I was so young, so stupid maybe. My parents—" She paused, swallowing hard. "When they found out I was pregnant, they were terrified of the scandal. You have to understand, things were different then. They sent me away to a home for unwed mothers in Connecticut. Told everyone I was visiting relatives." Lisa felt like she couldn't breathe. The implications of what her mother was saying started to sink in. "Dad," she whispered. "George adopted you when you were 2, Evelyn said, tears running down her face now. "He loved you from the moment he met you. He wanted to be your father in every way that mattered. We thought we were protecting you by not telling you." It seemed kinder somehow. The room spun slightly as Lisa tried to process this information. All these years, all these memories, they weren't lies exactly, but they weren't the whole truth either. She thought about her father, the man who had raised her, who had taught her to ride a bike, who had walked her down the aisle at her wedding. He had known all along. "Who?" Lisa started, then had to clear her throat to continue. "Who is my biological father?" Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap. "His name was Daniel Mitchell. He was a lifeguard at the beach where we spent that summer. He never knew about you. My parents made sure of that. They said it would be better for everyone if he never knew." Mitchell. Sarah's last name was Mitchell. The connection Lisa had been trying to understand suddenly became crystal clear. Her cousin wasn't a mysterious stranger. She was family in the truest sense, connected through a father Lisa had never known existed. The summer of 1969 felt different from the start. Evelyn's family had been coming to Ocean Grove for years, renting the same white cottage 3 blocks from the beach. But that year, everything seemed more vibrant somehow. Maybe it was the music floating from transistor radios, songs about peace and love that made even her strict parents tap their feet. Or maybe it was just that she was 16, and 16 has a way of making everything feel more alive. She got the job at Morton's Candy Shop on her second day in town. The owner, Mrs. Morton, hired her on the spot, saying she had honest eyes. The shop was a maze of glass jars filled with colorful candies, and the air always smelled like chocolate and saltwater taffy. Evelyn worked the afternoon shift, serving ice cream to sunburned tourists and wrapped candies to local kids who pressed their noses against the glass display cases. That's where she first saw Daniel. He came in wearing red swim trunks and a white t-shirt with guard printed across the chest, his hair still damp from the ocean. He bought a pack of licorice and smiled at her in a way that made her forget how to count change. She noticed his eyes first. They were the exact color of the sea on a cloudy day. He started coming in regularly after his shifts ended, always ordering something different, always finding a reason to chat. Sometimes he'd lean against the counter while she cleaned up, telling her stories about the rescues he'd made that day. Most were just helping kids who'd gone out too far, but he made each tale sound like an adventure. The ocean's got its own personality, he'd say, twirling a peppermint stick between his fingers. You've got to learn its moods, respect its power. He talked about the water the way other people talked about old friends, and Evelyn found herself hanging on every word. Their first real conversation happened during her break. She'd walked down to the beach, carrying a paper bag with 2 ice cream sandwiches, one for herself and one for him. He was sitting in his lifeguard chair, scanning the water with the focus of someone who took their job seriously. When she held up the ice cream, his whole face lit up. They sat in the sand, watching kids build crooked sandcastles while the ice cream melted faster than they could eat it. Daniel told her about his plans to study marine biology, how he wanted to understand everything about the ocean. Evelyn shared her dreams of becoming a teacher, though she'd never told anyone else. Her parents thought teaching was a waste of time for a girl who'd eventually get married anyway. After that, it became their routine. She'd take her break around 4, when the afternoon crowd started thinning out, and they'd meet by his lifeguard stand. Sometimes they'd walk along the water's edge, collecting shells and talking about everything and nothing. Other times they'd just sit quietly, watching the waves roll in and out, like the ocean was breathing. The other lifeguards teased Daniel about his candy shop girl, but he didn't seem to mind. He had this way of looking at her like she was the only person on the beach, like whatever she was saying was the most interesting thing he'd ever heard. When he smiled, a little dimple appeared in his left cheek, and Evelyn found herself trying to make him smile just to see it. One evening, as the sun was setting and the beach was almost empty, he taught her about rip currents. See how the water looks different there? He pointed to a spot where the waves weren't breaking normally. That's how you spot them. Most people panic and try to swim straight back to shore, but that's exactly what you shouldn't do. He showed her how to swim parallel to the beach to escape the current, his hand gentle on her shoulder as he explained. They shared their first kiss that night, sitting on a weathered wooden bench on the boardwalk. The air smelled like cotton candy and salt spray, and somewhere in the distance, someone was playing In the Summer of Love on a portable radio. It was perfect in that way, that only summer moments can be sweet and fleeting and impossible to hold on to. Neither of them talked about what would happen when summer ended. It hung between them like an unspoken agreement. This wasn't meant to last beyond the warm days and endless twilights of July and August. Daniel would go back to college in California, and Evelyn would return to her life in New Jersey. They were living in a bubble of summer magic, and maybe that's what made everything feel so intense, so important. Lisa sat in her car outside her childhood home, trying to process everything her mother had just told her. The house she'd grown up in looked different now, as if the revelation had changed even the physical structure of her memories. She thought about her dad, George Thompson, the man who had raised her, who had shown up to every school play, every soccer game, every important moment of her life. She remembered the way he'd taught her to ride a bike in their driveway, running alongside her with his hand on the seat until she found her balance. How he'd built her a treehouse in the backyard, carefully sanding every board so she wouldn't get splinters. The way he'd sit at the kitchen table helping her with math homework, even though numbers had never been his strong suit. Her brothers, Tom and Mike, had always teased her about being Dad's favorite. Teacher's pet, they'd say when she got to stay up later than them, or when Dad let her help him wash the car on Saturday mornings. She'd loved those mornings, just the two of them, him teaching her the proper way to wax a car, how to check the tire pressure, all those little things that made her feel special. Now she understood why he'd tried so hard, why he'd always gone the extra mile. He'd chosen to be her father. While her brothers were born into the family, She'd been chosen, specifically and purposefully. The thought brought fresh tears to her eyes. All those years, he'd known she wasn't his biological daughter, but he'd never once let it show. Not once had he treated her differently from Tom or Mike. She pulled out her phone and looked at the last text from Sarah. They'd been messaging back and forth all morning, trying to make sense of their connection. Now it was crystal clear. They were cousins through Daniel, the lifeguard who'd never known he had a daughter. The father who died without ever meeting her. The cracks in her mother's story were obvious now. How had she never noticed before? The way her mom would get quiet when people mentioned family resemblances. The strange looks from older relatives at family gatherings when someone would say she had her father's eyes. She'd always assumed they meant George's eyes, but now she wondered if they'd been thinking about how little she looked like him. Lisa scrolled through old photos on her phone, stopping at one from her wedding day. There was George, beaming with pride as he walked her down the aisle. She remembered how he'd squeezed her hand right before they started walking, whispering, "You'll always be my little girl." Had he been thinking about this moment then? About the secret they'd all kept from her? She thought about her own kids now, playing at home with their dad. Jack was 7, Emma 5. They adored their grandfather George, who spoiled them rotten with ice cream before dinner and countless trips to the toy store. Would this change how they saw him? Should it? The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across her parents' front yard. Through the window, she could see her mother moving around the kitchen, probably making dinner like she always did. Everything looked so normal, so ordinary, but nothing was normal anymore. The truth about Daniel Mitchell hung in the air like a ghost, changing the shape of every memory, every family story. Her phone buzzed with another message from Sarah. "I found some old photos of my Uncle Daniel." It read, "Would you like to see them?" Lisa's heart jumped. Until now, her biological father had been just a name, a character in her mother's story. But photos would make him real. They would give him a face, an identity. With shaking fingers, she typed back, "Yes. Please send them." Then she sat in her car, waiting, wondering what piece of herself she might recognize in a stranger's face. Lisa sat at her kitchen table late that night, her laptop open in front of her. The house was quiet. Her husband had taken the kids to their swimming lessons, giving her some space to process everything. She'd been staring at the search bar for almost 10 minutes. Daniel Mitchell's name typed, but not yet searched. The photos Sarah had sent earlier were spread out on the table beside her laptop. They showed a young man with wavy hair and an easy smile, standing proud in his lifeguard uniform or laughing with friends on the beach. In one photo, he was sitting on a lifeguard stand, shielding his eyes from the sun, the same casual pose she'd seen in countless beach photos, but this one made her heart ache. This was her father, frozen in time, forever young and unaware of the daughter he would never meet. Finally, she pressed enter, watching as search results filled her screen. Social media profiles, business listings, newspaper articles. There were dozens of Daniel Mitchells. She added Ocean Grove to the search, then lifeguard. The results narrowed. Her cursor hovered over a link to an obituary from a local newspaper. Her hands trembled as she clicked. The page loaded slowly, revealing a formal announcement dated 5 years ago. Daniel James Mitchell, 68, passed away suddenly at his home in Beach Haven, New Jersey. She read the words over and over, each time hoping they might somehow change. But they remained stubbornly the same, cold, factual proof that she would never meet her biological father. The obituary painted a picture of a life she would never know firsthand. Daniel had become a marine biologist, just like he'd told her mother he wanted to be. He'd worked at various research stations along the East Coast, studying ocean currents and marine life. He'd never married, though he'd stayed close to his family, especially his sister Margaret, Sarah's mother. The cause of death had been a heart attack, quick and unexpected, the obituary said. He'd been found in his study, surrounded by research papers and photographs of the ocean. Even at the end, he'd been doing what he loved. Somehow, that detail made Lisa's eyes fill with tears. She would never know if he'd had her mother's smile, or if his laugh would have sounded familiar, or if he would have loved being a grandfather to her children. She called Sarah, needing to share this moment with someone who might understand. Sarah answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for the call. I found the obituary, Lisa said, her voice barely steady. He never knew about me. No, Sarah replied softly. But I remember him, Lisa. He was my favorite uncle. He used to visit us every summer, bringing shells and telling us stories about the ocean. He would have loved knowing about you. They talked for hours, Sarah sharing memories of the uncle she'd known, Lisa soaking up every detail. Daniel had been kind, Sarah said, always ready with a joke or a story. He'd never lost his love for the ocean. Even in his 60s, he'd swim every morning before work. He'd kept a collection of sand from every beach he'd ever visited, each sample carefully labeled and dated. He was alone when he died, Lisa said, voicing the thought that had been haunting her since she read the obituary. In his house, with no one there. I know, Sarah replied. We all wished he'd found someone, settled down. Now I can't help wondering if losing your mom that summer affected him more than anyone knew. He never talked about that time, but he never really got close to anyone either. After hanging up, Lisa walked out to her back porch. The night was clear, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of waves breaking on the shore. She thought about Daniel, about all the mornings he must have spent watching those same waves, never knowing his daughter was out there somewhere. She pulled up the photos Sarah had sent again, studying them on her phone screen. In one, Daniel was holding up a starfish, explaining something to a group of kids on the beach. His face was animated, engaged. She could almost hear his voice, though she'd never know what it really sounded like. She wondered what he would have taught her about the ocean, what stories he would have shared, what pieces of himself she might have recognized in her own love of the sea. The drive to Ocean Grove took just under 2 hours, but to Lisa, it felt like traveling back in time. She told her husband she needed to do this alone, and he'd understood, offering to take the kids to his parents' house for the day. The late spring weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with just enough breeze to rustle the trees along the highway. She'd looked up old photos of the town online, trying to picture how it might have looked in 1969. According to her research, much of Ocean Grove's Victorian architecture had been preserved, protected by historical society regulations. As she drove past the town's entrance, it felt like stepping into a postcard from the past. The streets were lined with gingerbread-trimmed houses, their porches decorated with hanging baskets and American flags. Lisa drove slowly, imagining her 16-year-old mother walking these same streets, perhaps wearing one of those mini dresses she'd seen in old photographs. Had she been happy that summer, before everything changed? Had she walked these sidewalks holding Daniel's hand, planning their next meeting at the candy shop? She parked near the beach, in a lot that probably hadn't changed much in 50 years. The sound of waves hitting the shore was immediate and familiar, even though she'd never been here before. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the distant laughter of children playing on the beach. She grabbed her bag, which contained the old photos Sarah had sent, and headed toward the boardwalk. Morton's Candy Shop wasn't hard to find. It was still there, though the sign was different now. The original had been red and white striped, according to her mother's description. This one was blue and white, with Morton's Sweet Shop, EST 1940, written in fancy gold letters. But the windows still displayed rows of colorful candies, and a bell still chimed when she pushed open the door. Inside, the shop smelled exactly as her mother had described, like chocolate and salt water taffy mixed with ocean air. The glass cases were modern now, but they still held rows of candies and ice cream. An elderly woman behind the counter smiled at her, and Lisa had to remind herself that this wasn't Mrs. Morton. She'd passed away years ago, according to the current owner. "Can I help you find something?" the woman asked, and Lisa almost said no. But then she pulled out one of the photos Sarah had sent, showing Daniel in his lifeguard uniform, holding a paper bag from Morton's. "Actually, yes," Lisa said, her voice catching slightly. "I was wondering, did this shop sell licorice back in the 60s? Black licorice, specifically?" The woman's eyes lit up. "Oh yes, we've always carried it. It was one of our specialties. Still is, actually. Would you like to try some?" Lisa bought a small bag, even though she'd never been particularly fond of licorice. She sat on a bench outside the shop, holding the bag just like Daniel had in the photo. The taste was strong and distinctive, exactly the same, she imagined, as what he'd bought during those summer days when he'd stopped by to see her mother. She walked along the boardwalk, matching landmarks to the background details in Sarah's photos. The beach looked different now, wider in some places, narrower in others, the natural result of 50 years of tides and storms. But the rhythm of the waves was eternal, unchanged since her parents had walked here as teenagers. A row of lifeguard stands dotted the beach, their red and white paint bright in the sunlight. They were more modern than the wooden one in the old photos, but their purpose remained the same. Lisa watched a young lifeguard scan the water, remembering the photo of Daniel doing the same thing, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. She took out her phone and sent a picture to Sarah, the current candy shop, the beach, a lifeguard stand. "It's strange," she wrote. "Everything's different, but somehow exactly the same." Sarah replied almost immediately. He loved that place. Never stopped talking about that summer on the beach, though he never said why it was so special. Now we know. The beach had begun to empty as the afternoon wore on. Families packed up their umbrellas and towels, shaking off sand and calling to their children. Lisa watched them go, sitting on a weathered wooden bench near the boardwalk. She'd been here for hours now, walking the same paths her parents once had, trying to piece together the fragments of their story. The lifeguard stand stood like sentinels along the shoreline. She'd been avoiding them all day, but now, in the quiet of late afternoon, she felt drawn to them. According to Sarah's photos and the old beach patrol records she'd found online, Daniel had usually worked the stand near Phillips Avenue, the third one from the pier. She walked toward it slowly, her shoes sinking slightly in the soft sand. The current stand was newer, of course, but it stood in the same spot. The beach patrol still used the same numbering system they had back then. She touched the wooden ladder, feeling the salt-worn texture under her fingers. How many times had Daniel climbed these steps, or steps just like them? A cool breeze came off the water, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and purple. Lisa remembered something Sarah had told her during one of their long phone calls. How Daniel used to say sunset was the best time to watch the water, when the changing light revealed things you might miss in the harsh glare of midday. She climbed the stand carefully, settling into the seat where her father had once kept watch. The view was breathtaking. From this height, she could see the curve of the coastline, the way the waves formed patterns as they approached the shore. She thought about what Daniel had told her mother about rip currents, how you could spot them if you knew what to look for. Pulling out the old photos again, she held them up against the horizon. In one, Daniel sat in almost exactly this position, one leg propped up, his rescue tube ready beside him. The background was different, fewer buildings, different styles of beach umbrellas, but the ocean looked exactly the same. The waves still broke in the same places, following the unchanging contours of the seafloor. A seagull landed on the rail beside her, fearless in the way of beach birds. She wondered if Daniel had made friends with the seagulls too, during those long hours of watching the water. Had he given them names? Had he shared his lunch with them on quiet days? These were the kind of small, ordinary details she would never know about him. From her perch, she could see couples walking along the water's edge, their footprints quickly erased by the incoming tide. She imagined her parents doing the same thing, young and caught up in their summer romance. Had they known, somehow, that their time together would echo through generations? That the choices they made would shape lives they couldn't yet imagine? The sun was nearly gone now, the sky deepening to indigo. The first stars were appearing, bright points of light that must have looked exactly the same 50 years ago. She took out her phone and snapped a picture of the view, sending it to both Sarah and her mother. "I get it now," she wrote. "Why you loved it here. Why you both did." Her mother's response came first. "Oh, honey." Just those two words, but Lisa could feel the emotion behind them. Sarah's came a moment later. "He always said there was something magical about that beach at sunset. I think maybe he was right." Lisa stayed in the stand until the stars were fully out, listening to the rhythm of the waves. She thought about all the paths that had led to this moment. Her mother's secret, Daniel's unknowing absence, her own journey of discovery. The truth had changed everything, and yet here was something unchangeable, The eternal motion of the tide, the stars wheeling overhead, the salt spray in the air. In this place, for this moment, she felt connected to both her fathers, the one who had raised her with love, and the one who had never known she existed. Evelyn sat in her living room, surrounded by old photo albums she'd pulled from the attic. She hadn't looked at these in years. It had been easier that way, to keep the past neatly boxed up and out of sight. But now, with the truth finally out in the open, she felt compelled to revisit these memories. The photos from before that summer were easy to look at: birthday parties, family vacations, school events. She'd been such a different person then, so young and sure of how her life would unfold. But the gap in the albums told its own story. 9 months missing, explained away as an extended visit to relatives. The next photos showed her back home, wearing loose-fitting clothes, her smile a bit too bright, a bit too forced. She picked up her phone and looked at the sunset photo Lisa had sent from the beach. Her daughter was there right now, sitting in the same spot where Daniel had once watched the waves. The thought made her chest tight. All these years, she'd told herself the secret was better kept, that knowing would only hurt Lisa. Now she wondered if the real person she'd been protecting was herself. George came in from the garage, where he'd been tinkering with his old radio set. He took one look at the photos spread across the coffee table and understood. Without a word, he sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. They'd carried this secret together for so long, sharing the weight of it through decades of family dinners, school plays, and holiday celebrations. "I was so scared back then," Evelyn said softly, touching a photo of herself as a teenager. "My parents acted like I'd committed some terrible crime. They were more worried about what the neighbors would think than how I felt. When they sent me away..." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know how to fight back. I didn't know I could." George squeezed her hand. "You were just a kid yourself," he reminded her. "You did what you thought was right at the time." "But I kept lying," she said. "Even after we got married, even after my parents were gone. I told myself it was better for Lisa not to know. Every time she asked about family medical history, every time someone mentioned how different she looked from her brothers, I just kept adding to the lie." She picked up another photo, Lisa's high school graduation. George stood proudly beside their daughter, beaming at the camera. He'd never once made Lisa feel like she wasn't his own. "You were the brave one," she told him. "You loved her without conditions, without secrets. She was easy to love," George said simply. "Still is." Evelyn's phone buzzed with another message from Lisa. A photo of Morton's candy shop at twilight, its windows glowing warmly. "Do you remember what kind of ice cream you used to get?" Lisa had written, "I want to try your favorite." The question brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. Even now, after learning about the deception that had shaped her life, Lisa was reaching out, trying to understand, to connect. It would have been easier, maybe, for her to be angry, to shut Evelyn out. Instead, she was at the beach, walking in her mother's footsteps, seeking to understand rather than condemn. "She's stronger than I ever was," Evelyn said, showing George the message. "More forgiving, too." "She gets that from you," George replied. "That capacity for love, for understanding. That's all you, Evelyn." Evelyn typed back her response with shaking fingers. "Maple walnut. And Daniel always got licorice." She hesitated, then added, "I have more photos if you want to see them. Real ones from that summer. I kept them hidden in an old journal. It's time they came out of hiding, too." Sarah sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes she'd dragged up from her basement. After Lisa's visit to Ocean Grove, she'd been inspired to dig through her own family archives. As a nurse, she was used to long shifts and odd hours, but she'd taken a rare day off for this task. Each box contained pieces of the past, photos, letters, holiday cards, and countless other memories her mother had carefully preserved. She'd been sending photos to Lisa all morning, each one sparking new conversations. A shot of Daniel at a family barbecue in 1985, looking exactly like the lifeguard in the beach photos, just with slightly grayer hair. A Christmas card he'd sent, showing him on his research boat, grinning despite the obvious cold. Little pieces of the father Lisa had never known. Her phone buzzed with a new message. "You from Lisa? I can't believe how much Jack looks like him in that beach photo. Same smile, same way of tilting his head." Sarah smiled, thinking of Lisa's 7-year-old son whom she'd only seen in photos so far. The family resemblance was striking, proof that genes could skip across decades, connecting people who'd never met. In one box, she found something unexpected, her mother's old diary from 1970. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. Her eyes caught on an entry from July. "Danny seems different since he came back from Ocean Grove. Something happened there, I think, but he won't talk about it. He spends more time at the beach than ever, just staring at the waves." Sarah took a photo of the diary entry and sent it to Lisa. They'd been doing this for weeks now, sharing pieces of their separate histories, slowly weaving them together into a complete picture. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes they'd find something that would make them both cry, like the photo of Daniel holding Sarah as a baby, knowing he'd never had the chance to hold his own daughter. "We should meet," Lisa texted back. "Actually meet in person. I'm tired of getting to know my cousin through a phone screen." Sarah felt her heart jump. They talked about meeting, but always in a someday kind of way. Now it felt real, possible. "Yes," she wrote back. "Come to North Carolina. I'll show you where Daniel used to take me fishing when I was little." They spent the next hour planning. Lisa would come next month, staying for a long weekend. Sarah had so many places she wanted to show her. The pier where Daniel had taught her about different types of fish, the ice cream shop he'd always insisted had the best mint chocolate chip in the state, the beach where he'd spent his final years studying wave patterns. "I found something else," Sarah wrote, pulling out a small box she'd discovered at the bottom of one of the larger containers. His shell collection. He kept one from every beach he ever visited. They're all labeled with dates and locations. She sent a photo of a particularly beautiful spiral shell, its label reading, "Ocean Grove, August 1969. Lisa's response took a few minutes to come through. That was their last month together. Mom said they used to collect shells on their evening walks. Sarah carefully wrapped the shell in tissue paper. She'd give it to Lisa when she visited, a small piece of the past, something that connected all of them across time. Her mother had always said Daniel was the keeper of family memories, the one who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every small detail of their shared history. Now Sarah understood that role had passed to her, but with an unexpected twist. She wasn't just preserving memories anymore. She was helping to uncover them. "Bring your kids when you come," Sarah wrote. "I want to meet my little cousins. Plus, I have some of Daniel's old marine biology books. Jack might like them if he's interested in the ocean." She thought about how much Daniel would have loved teaching his grandson about marine life, showing him how to identify different species of fish, explaining why the waves move the way they did. "I will," Lisa replied. "They should know this part of their family too. It's their history as much as mine." After a pause, another message came through. "Thank you, Sarah, for helping me find him, piece by piece." Sarah looked at the boxes around her, each one containing fragments of a life that had touched so many others, even without knowing it. "We're family," she wrote back. "This is what family does. We help each other find our way home." Summer faded into fall, and the initial shock of the revelation gradually gave way to a new normal. Lisa found herself stopping by her parents' house more often, usually unannounced, bringing coffee and sitting with her mother in the kitchen. These visits were different now, more honest, more real somehow. They talked about things they'd never discussed before, filling in the gaps of their shared history. Evelyn had kept her promise about the hidden photos. She pulled out an old leather-bound journal from the back of her closet, its pages stuffed with photographs from that summer in '69. They spent hours going through them together, Evelyn's voice growing stronger as she shared stories she'd kept locked away for decades. "He taught me how to body surf," she said one afternoon, showing Lisa a blurry photo of waves breaking on the shore. "Said I was a natural. We spent hours in the water, waiting for the perfect wave." Her eyes got that distant look they often had now when talking about the past. "I used to watch you in the ocean when you were little, the way you dive under the waves without fear. You reminded me so much of him then, though I could never say it." Lisa's relationship with George, Dad, as she still called him without hesitation, had shifted too, not weakening, but deepening. They did a long talk in his garage one weekend while he worked on his old Chevy, the one he'd been restoring for years. "I wanted to tell you so many times," he'd said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. But it never seemed like the right moment. Then time just kept passing, and the truth felt harder to share. Sarah had become a constant presence in their lives, even from several states away. She and Lisa texted daily, sharing everything from family stories to silly memes. Their weekend visits had become regular events, alternating between their homes. Sarah's nursing schedule was tricky to work around, but they made it work, understanding now that time with family was precious. During Sarah's last visit, they'd taken the kids to the beach. Watching Jack and Emma play in the waves with their newfound cousin, Lisa felt a sense of rightness she hadn't expected. Sarah taught them how to identify different seashells, using Daniel's old marine biology books as guides. "Your grandfather would have loved this," she told them, and the words felt natural, true. Lisa had started keeping a journal of her own, writing down everything she learned about Daniel. Small details from Sarah's memories, stories from his colleagues that she'd tracked down, even notes about his research papers. She wanted her children to know this part of their heritage, to understand where their love of the ocean came from. One evening, as she added notes about Daniel's favorite books, Sarah had found a list in one of his old notebooks. Her husband Tom came in and sat beside her. "You seem more at peace," he said quietly. "These past few months, it's like you found something you didn't know you were missing." She thought about that for a while. The truth was, discovering Daniel's existence had filled a space she hadn't recognized was empty. Not because George had been anything less than a wonderful father, but because understanding where you come from, knowing your own story, matters in ways that are hard to explain. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, another found photo, this one showing Daniel giving a presentation at a marine research center. He was pointing at a diagram of ocean currents, his face animated with enthusiasm. "Look what I found in Mom's attic," Sarah wrote. "Think Jack might want this for his science project?" Lisa smiled, thinking of her son's growing interest in marine biology. Some things, it seemed, ran in the family. She saved the photo to show him later, adding another piece to the puzzle of their shared history. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be understood, accepted, even celebrated. And in that acceptance, she'd found not just healing, but growth, new connections, deeper relationships, and a fuller sense of who she was and where she came from. 1 year to the day after discovering Daniel's obituary, Lisa found herself back at Ocean Grove Beach. The morning air was crisp, carrying that distinct edge that marked the transition from summer to fall. She'd chosen to come alone this time, though Sarah had offered to join her. Some moments needed to be faced in solitude. The beach was quiet at this early hour. A few joggers passed by, their footsteps muffled in the damp sand. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their calls mixing with the steady rhythm of the waves. Lisa walked slowly along the water's edge, letting the cold foam wash over her feet. She'd done this walk several times now throughout the year, but today felt different. She carried Daniel's shell in her pocket, the one from '69 that Sarah had given her. Its smooth surface had become familiar under her fingers, a tangible connection to the past. She developed a habit of holding it during important moments. When Jack won his science fair project on ocean ecosystems, when Emma learned to swim, when she and her mother had their long, healing conversations about the past. The lifeguard stand where she'd sat last year stood empty, waiting for the day's shift to begin. Lisa climbed up and settled into the familiar seat. From here, she could see the whole sweep of the beach, the same view Daniel had watched over decades ago. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. She pulled out her phone and opened the photo album she'd created over the past year. Pictures of Daniel through the decades, photos of her mother's summer romance, snapshots of her own family at the beach. The last photo was from last weekend. Jack standing in the waves, pointing out something to his sister, their faces bright with excitement. They had Daniel's profile, his way of gesturing when explaining something interesting. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. Lisa closed her eyes and listened to the waves, thinking about how this same sound had been the backdrop to so many stories. Her parents' summer love, Daniel's lifelong passion for marine biology, her own children's growing fascination with the ocean. Some things remained constant, unchanging, while life flowed around them like water around rocks. She took the shell from her pocket and held it up to the rising sun. Its spiral pattern caught the light, revealing subtle colors she'd never noticed before. After a moment's hesitation, she climbed down from the stand and walked to the water's edge. She'd been carrying this shell for months now, this piece of her parents' past, this fragment of a story that had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. Bending down, she let the incoming wave wash over her hand, still holding the shell. She didn't let go, not yet, but felt the pull of the water, the eternal rhythm of the tide. The ocean that had drawn Daniel to become a lifeguard, that had brought her parents together, that now called to her own children, remained the same ocean. It held all their stories, all their connections. Lisa straightened up, tucking the shell back into her pocket. She wasn't ready to let it go, she realized. Maybe she never would be, and that was okay. Some things were meant to be kept, to be passed down, to remind us where we came from and who we are. She took one last photo, the sunrise over the waves, and sent it to both Sarah and her mother. No words, just the image of light breaking over endless water. Their responses came quickly, as if they'd been waiting. A heart emoji from Sarah, love you from her mom. Simple acknowledgments of a moment shared across distance and time. Walking back along the beach, Lisa felt at peace. The truth about her past had changed everything and nothing. She was still her father's daughter, both her fathers in different but equally important ways. The ocean had brought them all together, had kept their secrets, and had finally helped reveal them. And here it remained, constant and eternal, carrying their stories forward with each wave that broke upon the shore.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.